Yeah.
Right.
Okay, we are live. It is Friday, April 9th, Senate Government Operations. And what we're going to do today, committee, is a couple things. We're going to hear in, I never can remember the act number. I can remember it was S124, but I don't remember the act number. We requested a bunch of reports to come back. Some were official reports and some were just to report to us on different aspects. And two of those were, there was usually a lead agency or organization that would lead the discussion, and two of them were assigned to the AG's office. And those two were because Julio had talked with us before about different forms of citizen oversight committees and citizen review committees, and we felt we needed to be very careful instead of designing any kind of a model to look at what the different types are, because different types might fit better into different types of communities. A small community without a police force might have a very different one than Burlington, that has is a city with its own police force. So Julio had talked to us a little bit about some of those before, and so we just asked him to come back, having done some research, and to look at it. And then this is something that hopefully we can get out to the communities so that they can, and I think the LEAB was involved in different people. So we're going to hear about that progress. And then we're going to, the other thing that was assigned to, as the AG, as the lead, was whether or not there should be a central reporting point for allegations of misconduct by law enforcement officers. And if so, where that should live. Should it be in the AG's office? Should it be with the council? Should it be with the academy? So anyway, and then how much of that should be public and when should it be public and all that information. So those are the two that we're going to hopefully hear a little bit more about today. And then at, I believe it's 2:00, we're going to do a walkthrough of the Code of Ethics and hopefully vote out H135. So any questions, committee? All right. So Julio, thank you for joining us.
Good to see you. Good afternoon.
And so do you want to just take it away?
Okay, thank you. So for the record, I'm Julio Thompson. I'm an Assistant Attorney General, Director of the Civil Rights Unit. Madam Chair, there are a few members of the committee who I don't think have heard me testify before. Do you want a little bit of background about my work in policing oversight, or just proceed to
Sure. Yeah, no, that would be great. And do you know everybody here? I figured you probably did.
Yes, I've met them before in different contexts, but several members here I haven't talked on the subject of policing before at all.
Okay, great. Well, sure. So a little background of information about your background would be helpful to the committee, I believe.
Okay. So I moved to Vermont in 2004 from Los Angeles. After graduating from law school, I practiced as a lawyer in Los Angeles doing employment, labor, and civil rights work. My first work in the area of police reform began in November of 1991. When there was a series of shootings of African-American and Latino community members by the LA County Sheriff's Department, which at the time was the fourth largest law enforcement agency in the country. It's as large as the LAPD in terms of patrol and policing functions, and it also runs the LA County Jail, which is the largest jail in the country, in the West, really, with about 23,000 beds. Wow. It's a big organization. And I was asked to be part of a 6-month study of the LA County Sheriff's Department top to bottom to look at issues of use of force, citizens' complaints, accountability and the like. At the time, this was a department that was facing allegations of severe beatings, of chained prisoners, of white supremacist gangs within the agency itself. The outcome in July of 1992, which was 2 months after the LA riots following the initial acquittals of Rodney King, there was a report with about 275 odd recommendations for reform. The LA County Board of Supervisors, which funds the Sheriff's Department, decided to create basically the country's first police monitor. And we'll talk about monitoring models for oversight. But they created an office of monitor. At the time, they called it the Office of Special Counsel because it was staffed by attorneys. That was responsible for ensuring implementation of those reforms. So if the sheriff said, okay, we will change X or Y, it was the monitor's job to dig in and embed itself in the department and report back to the board on progress on those reforms. At the same time, the duty of the monitor was to research best practices from around the country and also overseas, in Ireland and the UK in particular, to identify better ways of encountering the community that provided less risk for officers and the public, and to work with the department to introduce them, to those best practices. So I served as as a deputy monitor in that setup from 1993 to 2004. After I accepted a job at the state of Vermont, I ended up resigning and then traveling across the country. When I was in that position as a deputy monitor, the areas I focused on was citizens' complaints and officer accountability, use of force tactics, de-escalation, crisis intervention, the K-9 unit and SWAT units, as well as incarceration, the mentally ill. Part of that job wasn't just doing document review. A monitor's office really, to be effective, has to be enmeshed in the department. So I participated in academy and also continuing trainings, including scenario trainings as a role player as the officer, the hostage, the bystander, or the perpetrator. I embedded with the K-9 unit and rode with them to calls. I rode with the gang enforcement team and all of the specialized units so that I could see from a day-to-day operational standpoint how the department really works. A monitoring entity that is confined merely to paper review is sort of like surveying the ocean from the deck of a cruise ship. So part of the monitoring model, though it sounds maybe more like an auditor where a lot of it is done by paper, it involves a lot of time that's spent in the department, but also in the community. So we spent a lot of time with all of the community organizations, business leaders, victim advocates, and the like. Following that work, or the start of that work, which started to yield results in Los Angeles, other cities started to notice the work of that monitor's office. So in 1996, the city of Detroit hired the monitor and me to do a study of their use of force and accountability systems following the murder of a Detroiter named Malice Green by 2 Detroit police officers who were convicted of the murder. It was a beating death and quite grisly. We also were asked to then go to different parts of the country and look at their existing or proposed remedies for policing practices or civilian oversight. So that included cities like Philadelphia, Burbank, Oakland, Phoenix, Portland, Oregon, and Denver. In 1999, I'll just try to shorten this up. I don't want to run too long. In 1999, the U.S. Department of Justice asked me to train its lawyers on how to review police shootings from the outsider perspective. And then that led to work that I've been doing off and on as an expert for DOJ on a number of cities, including Washington, D.C., Seattle, Baltimore, Newark, Maricopa County, Arizona, and most recently, Springfield, Massachusetts. I worked on an investigation that was completed last year. Within the state of Vermont, my role is principally in this civil rights unit has been more in the area of hate crimes. I do training with at the police academy on hate crimes. So a lot of the expertise, if you can call it that, I just call it experience and learning, comes from a lot of work that I've done in other parts of the state. I have not participated as a monitor or an oversight member for any entity in the state. I have provided technical assistance from time to time to the state police, as well as some municipalities, on ideas that they are either on issues of investigations or models that communities are thinking about for their own version of oversight. So that's my background. I've never served on a review board as such. My personal involvement has either to serve as a monitor or deputy monitor myself, or be tasked to audit review boards and police departments coming in from the outside to find out what works and what doesn't, and to propose fixes to make sure that it's meeting what the community wants them to meet. So I'll stop there if there's any questions about that.
Anybody have any questions about, Senator Clarkson?
Well, after becoming such an expert on all these things, Julio, all over the country, the obvious question is, why Vermont? But we can have that offline at another point, but I'd love to hear that story.
Yeah, I mean, with the great indulgence from the two attorneys general that I've served with, they've allowed me to continue to do this work on my off hours. So my vacation time for many years has been spent on these other entities, and I'm still engaged on some of those projects. So it's not something I've surrendered. I mean, I'm still working on those issues with, right now, most of it involves either a federal consent decree monitor. I work for the consent decree monitor for Newark, New Jersey. I'm on the monitoring team. So
right.
That's a court appointed position. And then I'm also serving as an expert for DOJ on Baltimore and Maricopa County.
Wow.
There are a few things I think I've learned a lot more than I've taught or shared during the period of time. And there are a few things that along the way, at least for members who haven't heard testimony on the subject before, that are just lessons that were learned over time. And there are a few kind of key principles to keep in mind. One, the history of civilian oversight in the United States is not a very good history. There have been different models of civilian review entities for going on to 50 years in the United States. They all follow, or nearly all of them follow, a familiar birth story, which is that there is some critical flashpoint in a community, or sometimes nationally, as happened initially with Rodney King, and we've seen it several times since then, including what's going on in Minneapolis right now. And then and usually at the municipal level, there's a rush to create some sort of entity with vaguely defined powers, usually little funding, almost no training. And then they are tasked to meet once a month and do something, whether that's reviewing completed investigations or taking civilian complaints and the like. The other story of civilian oversight is that there's constant evolution of these entities. So the cycle of these, and I've provided, I think, the committee a white paper from the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement that talks about the history of the different models, is that many of them go through a cycle where time passes, the entity is forgotten in the public eye, and then additional critical incidents arise, and then all eyes are back on that entity, which is found to have been ineffectual, and then there's another reform. History teaches us, I think, who work in this area, and people in the communities that have worked in the area of police reform and civilian oversight and partnering, is that the quick solution doesn't usually work. And that's especially the case where it is a sort of top-down, a proposal where it comes from someone who already works in a city or county government. They come up with an idea, or they take an idea from another similarly sized city, and then they propose it, and then there's a limited period of public comment from the members of the community who are supposed to participate in this model and be served by it. The more successful efforts have really worked in the opposite way. They are born from ideas that are provided by the community first, that those ideas that principles are staked out by the community rather than the government. And then it is the government's role to try to match town and government operations to meet those needs. And part of those discussions necessarily include law enforcement, since they are going to be the ones who will be governed by and interacting with whatever the civilian oversight entity is. So they can't be excluded from the conversation, but they are, they are a co-producer of public safety. The community is the other co-producer. And so the more successful model or approach to developing a model builds up from the community. And so in connection with the work that we've done here so far in the AG's office, and we're not done, pursuant to Act 166, Chair White,
Thank you.
Section 16, we were tasked with soliciting input from different community groups, and municipalities to talk about what they want, what they think they can afford, what they think they're missing in terms of police accountability. And as you can expect, if you read the newspapers, in the last year and a half, even before the murder of George Floyd last May, they were already working at revising or attacking the issue of accountability to make sure that the police are serving the agenda or meeting the agenda that the community really sets. And so we've seen in the last year efforts, obviously in Burlington and in Brattleboro. We've seen it in smaller towns like Bennington or Vergennes, where communities are themselves doing the research and trying to identify what fits their organization. And it's important, as the chair noted at the outset, is that the size of police departments in Vermont varies widely. There are departments that have 2 officers and many departments that have fewer than a dozen officers. And so the capacity for a town to build or to invest in some larger structure to govern a dozen officers or fewer isn't really, or historically hasn't been viewed as an economical way to approach it. And so the default position in Vermont has been that it's the town managers usually, or the town select board, that are the ones who are expected to cast an eye on, say, an investigation of a complaint or a critical force incident. And in many cases, they don't have any training or support in the area of law enforcement. So they're at a serious disadvantage when it comes to evaluating, as an honest, neutral broker, what the circumstances are. And also they're at a disadvantage to know what alternatives to conflict, or encounters in conflict situation that are available to the department. It may be that the department or an officer follows a policy, but the problem may be with the policy itself. And historically, Vermont, it's no different than many other states. Towns and cities have individuals that just don't have that sort of background. And so that's kind of the problem statement that exists right now. So I could stop right there before I start talking about the individual models, if there are questions, because I don't want to get ahead of anybody or myself here.
Does anybody have any questions right now? I would just in thinking about whether we call it citizen oversight or review or whatever we end up calling it, is what really is the function of the committee? Is it just to review allegations of misconduct? Is it to, I mean, I think that it's important for people to understand what the breadth of the responsibility is and how that gets defined.
That's a great question. There really is no limit on what a community's participation in law enforcement is. And that's the way historically I viewed it. It's not merely oversight in policing, but participation in public safety. There are many models. Sometimes it's in a police commission model. Sometimes it's in the monitor model, where the community has direct input on the policies themselves, that they identify existing policies, do research on what are national best practices, maybe consult or engage experts, but also define for themselves what sort of police responses they want for certain types of calls. And so, for example, at Brattleboro in January, it released a large report. It was a major undertaking for Brattleboro, where a very useful section of the report, we don't have time today to go over it in any detail, but the community's review of their own policies identified what they viewed as systemic biases towards confrontation, towards an aggressive model of policing, towards, that basically captured a mindset that, according to the authors of the report, didn't really align with what the community was expecting its police to do. There are many models of, or many cities that have civilian entities that are responsible for providing that input and approving policies that serve the community. So it's not just complaints, it's the very policies themselves.
Senator Clarkson.
Thank you, Julio. I think our chair has also touched on this. I think you're right. I think it seems to be much more effective if it's community engagement and it's not just responding to complaints or responding to bad, awful things happening. It's really proactively addressing what is community's engagement with its public safety. What does it want? What does it need? And how do they envision it? How does it help further the vision and goals of the community?
Yeah, I mean, for example, when I worked on the Seattle consent decree, so in that one I worked for the court-appointed monitor. So the consent decree is overseen by a federal judge, and then in that case, he appointed a team of individuals with experience in police reform to oversee and monitor the Seattle Police Department's changes in how it was going to comply with constitutional policing and meet the community standards. A big issue in Seattle when we started, I think it started that in late 2013, was there were certain areas in Seattle, certain parks or squares that were frequented by individuals, or maybe were the homes of individuals who really were not supported by any of the existing systems for mental health or housing. And a study which we oversaw to identify the amount of 911 calls or police calls for service for these areas where there were only a few dozen individuals that were accounting for many hundreds of calls and many thousand, by different officers all the time. And so the community, they have a community council there that, that offers recommendations for policing. And they were very supportive of the creation of a unit of officers with a background in mental health and social work to be assigned to those areas, so that they knew after a period of time all of the people who occupied those areas, and so those officers knew the individuals, the residents, the community members, and vice versa. And in most of the cases where there was some public disturbance or nuisance, it related to medication or housing issues, and their job wasn't really to show up with the handcuffs, but to make the calls and cut through some of the red tape in the city to get those individuals back in treatment, in a safe place at night, where they could avoid risk from other members of the community. That was dictated by the community. It was saying, why should we have these same couple dozen individuals encounter over the period of a year, maybe 20 or 30 patrol officers who don't know anything about them? They just show up and it's just another guy who lives in the park, rather than investing the time to have the department's employees zero in on these people, almost become de facto caseworkers, or work with their existing caseworkers so they could meet those needs and get some of them, as many as they could, off the streets and certainly in treatment where they needed both medical attention and rehabilitative services. So that was an example of a setting that came directly from the community. And the department, which was under a consent decree and had a new chief who was very effective, Kathleen O'Toole, former chief of the Boston Police Department, they were very, very receptive for that. It was a win-win for the department, because what they found is once they made that small investment, then the volume of the 911 calls started to decrease. And the use of force in where individuals would have to be removed from a scene because they presented a risk to themselves or others, the uses of force were cut by roughly 75%. It was really remarkable, because the people arriving at the scene didn't come with an arrest or use of force mindset. They came there more as with a guardian or a caregiver rather than a warrior mindset. And so when they arrive at the scene, it was all about helping that individual rather than forcefully removing that individual or commanding them to leave and then using force if they resisted. So that's just one example, and it's been utilized in other cities. That's just one I have some experience in, seeing how that program developed. So agenda setting and policy is one of those areas, and related to that is community input into training, officer training, to not merely to comment on officer behavior after it happens, but to make the investment up front to see whether they are training their officers to engage in confrontation. And so, that if you have having civilian or community input means that they should be welcome to review. It shouldn't be secretive in most cases. I mean, some SWAT-like tactics you don't want publicly disclosed for safety reasons, but in general, for the public or the community to be able to see firsthand what the training is, participate in it, and watch officers run through it, and then see whether their approach matches up with what the community's expectations are. So when I started in doing this, ages ago, one of the more frustrating areas of police encounters would be an officer's encounter with someone usually in crisis who had an edged weapon. So they had a knife or they had a broken bottle, they had an umbrella, they had some sharpened object that presented, was a deadly weapon, and no question, it was something that if they were to strike out at somebody could cause serious injury. And most of the training in most of the United States, the paradigm was all about appropriate distance and getting the firearm out, getting it in the low ready position, because the teaching at the time was to demonstrate how quickly someone could close the gap. There was a famous 21-foot rule that came out of a trainer from Salt Lake City, Utah, where they were trying to demonstrate for officer safety purposes that someone could close the 21-foot gap before an officer could unholster, point, and fire to defend themselves. There was very little focus on things like backing up or moving so that there was an obstacle like a car or a table between the person with the weapon and the officer. It was really only, there's been very slow progress, but progress on getting officers to focus on de-escalation. That every minute you spend talking to someone with a weapon and they're talking to you and they're not using the weapon is a victory for that officer, to allow other officers to arrive. If there's family members that need to be, at a distance, at a safe distance, that can help in the de-escalation, then they could do that. But you would see the results, and when I did monitoring, you could see the results on the street. The officers were just following what they'd been trained. And in a high stress situation, any professional, it's not just police officers, it's EMTs, it's airplane pilots, it's air traffic controllers. When they're in a high stress situation, they don't have much time to think. They will resort to their training. It is what's most available to them. And so participation in training, if you have the right training, and the training in an edged weapon encounter is time, distance, and talk, then that's what they will start to fall back on, rather than tactical position, unholster, low ready position. Because once the gun is out, the officer's options are very limited. Now the gun it's an asset for the officer, but it's also a liability because it's a deadly weapon that the officer might lose in the fight. So once it's out of the holster, the officer has narrowed a lot of their options. Certainly de-escalation is almost certainly off the page, because almost no one reacts positively if they're in crisis to seeing a drawn gun. And if the person closes with the officer, they would have to reholster and go downward to maybe use pepper spray or just to put their hands out to create distance. So resorting to that gun sort of traps the officer into a very narrow range of choices. And if that's the officer's training, then you'll get those predictable results. And so exposing it and, transparency on training, to get a fresh eye from the outside, to see how, if they do scenarios, what do the scenarios look like? Do the scenarios always have the bad guy? That's always a male, that's always a person of color, those sort of examples. It trains officers to disregard risks that might be presented to them by white females, for example, where their training examples are just, if there's a group and there are shots fired, I'm going to focus on the male as a potential threat. And that's dangerous, not only to those individuals, but that's dangerous to the officer, because they may be zeroing in on the wrong person. So that focus on the outside look on training can be very, very valuable, and start to slow down the pace, if not eliminate the sorts of bad outcomes on the street. So I'll stop there.
I noticed that I think Senator Rahm had a question.
Yeah, Julio, before we go on to the models, I hear you defining the problem statement, but kind of taking the same statement you just made and extrapolating it out, when there's a crisis in a community around their level of trust of the police, that's often when the police stop wanting to listen and hear what that crisis of trust is coming from the community. So I'm really curious how you and the Attorney General's office are working with police departments around the state to be at the table in equal relationship with the communities that they serve. Because I hear a lot of police officers, frankly, saying, well, we want to hear the community, but, we want to sit down at the table with them, and they still want to be at the head of the table. I don't think they really know what it looks like to truly be in equitable relationship with the communities they serve and have civilian oversight and have that conversation. So I feel a lot of defensiveness from law enforcement agencies, and that's not a good place to start these conversations. It doesn't build trust. So how are you helping them define the problem statement? Because we can't get to all these models until they are willing to sit down with the community and see that they have a problem with trust.
And I'm going to follow up with that, if I might. I believe that one of the weaknesses that was pointed out, and I may be wrong here, but I'm pretty sure I'm right, in the Brattleboro study that was done, was that law enforcement was not allowed at the table at all. There was no communication there. So that was the other side of what Keisha's alluding to here, is that you need to have both, and they need to be equal partners.
There's actually, so I could talk to some example. I mean, you both have defined the issue perfectly. There's inevitably resistance and fear when there's any kind of reform of an organization, and that's true of law enforcement as well. I could talk about some historically or examples that I've seen where, or how those fears manifest themselves, and to note success stories or failures. On the issue of participation, for example, in Seattle and in a different committee, in the judiciary committees, I've been testifying with others about the use of force policies and things like that. A lot of folks have been looking at use of force policies that really have spread out from Seattle. Seattle is viewed as having one of the more robust use of force policies in the country. I'm very familiar with that because I was working on that with the police department and the community and the unions. In Seattle, I think the agency and the city was very focused on participating with the community and very focused on dealing with the monitor, because they had to, frankly, they're under a court order. But I think the reports that came out was that there wasn't that much input with the officers' union about what the changes were going to be. And as a consequence, or certainly related to that, shortly after the policy was issued, I think it was 110 officers filed a lawsuit to enjoin the policy, and to make arguments in court about why this policy was inappropriate and put officers at risk. The lawsuit did not have merit on the law, and it was ultimately dismissed. But it was an example of the sort of failure, a process foul, if you will, that was committed during the development process, where not everybody felt like they had an equal voice. A lot of these officers sued on their own just because they themselves felt threatened and thought that options that they would use to save their lives if they were in high-risk situations were being removed. And that was very motivating to them. So you're right that everyone has to be at the table. One of the more successful use of force policies in the last 2 years that's been developed came out of Camden County, New Jersey, when Scott Thompson was the head of that department, and their use of force policy, which is viewed as again one of the standout policies in the country, was a project between New York University's policing project, the local ACLU and NAACP chapters, and the Fraternal Order of Police. that they were all, there was community involvement as well, but everyone worked together. So when the policy was at its final stage to be presented to the county government, the rank and file and the officer unions had provided their input, as had, again, other community stakeholders. So you're absolutely right that a successful outcome requires all voices there.
So how do you get to that point? How do you convince the law enforcement officers that the community needs to have an equal voice and they need to be there? And how do you convince the community that the law enforcement needs to be there at the table also? And how do you choose, I guess, which community members you're talking with and which police officers you're talking with? Because is it leadership in the police department that, I don't know if, I think we're getting into a little into more detail here. And what I'm going to suggest is that we continue this conversation for maybe 15 more minutes.
Okay. Because
I believe we have the ethics walkthrough at 2. Am I right about that? Gail, is that right?
2:30.
Oh, 2:30. Okay. So we have until 2:30. So let's, but I think we're going to continue this conversation again at another time also.
Okay.
So thank you, Senator Collmore. I was getting a little nervous here, but okay, thanks.
So there are a couple of issues that I identified. We're not in a position really to recommend a given model yet. And part of that is that the community input process for us is not done. It's not close to being done. A key ingredient for a successful change is that you have to spend the time. It's a slow moving process because you need to provide multiple opportunities for the community. It's harder to get the community's input because they're so diverse. It's not that hard to get a city attorney and a police chief in a room, but it's harder to get members of the community, particularly those who are afraid of their police departments, in the room or in a group setting. So it's more time consuming, but you have to invest that time, not only at the beginning, but as policies or training are being drafted, you have to provide multiple opportunities for people to take a look at that. So that's part of it. And that contact, if it's a respectful interaction, I find helps the relationship. Time spent in the room when people realize that the people who are on, quote, the opposite side, don't have a pitchfork and tail, that kind of thing, that you're talking with individuals, the personal interaction and regular interaction is really important. Yes.
Senator Collmore.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So one of the things that this committee and the legislature in general seems to struggle with, and I don't know that there's a right answer to this, is to get a sweet spot in terms of the number of people that you involve in this type of situation. You reach a point where if you get to 15, 16, 20, there's too many people to actually be able to get a lot of stuff done. But if you don't involve enough, you risk leaving an important voice out of the process too. Right. What have you discovered, Julio, in terms of sort of hitting that sweet spot in terms of the number of people involved?
Yeah, there's really, in terms of the community involvement and all the projects I've worked on where there are changes of policies, for example, there'll be a draft policy that is posted for public comment for a period of months. There might be public meetings to go through that policy. It's almost like rulemaking, a proposed rule and a comment period. In terms of organizational interactions, the community organizations are really vital because there will be people there who might have training or experience in the area. So they come to the table with knowledge, or they've come with models that they've gotten from sister organizations. But but those individuals are also going back to their constituency, and they need to have the opportunity to be there without you in the room. So if, you know, like in one city, I won't name names, but we might be talking about a policy with somebody who represents a local NAACP chapter, and then they're going to go back and talk to a whole bunch of people without you in the room, so that they can have that candid discussion without, you know, wondering what, you know, you might say or think about them, even as an outsider, where, you know, I might be somebody from another state. So just to give them that ability. So using those organizations as conduits, and also giving them advance notice of what you're going to talk about, so that before you, let's say you would meet with NAACP, for example, if there was a draft or an outline, you'd send it to them in advance and give them time to go talk with the community and get their input again on their own, fully candid without you, so that when they met you, they were ready to talk. They weren't just kind of reacting in the moment and not having an opportunity to get that advanced feedback. And that's part of what slows it down a little bit. But you really do get very, very meaningful input that way. Places that don't follow that typically will have policies that will go out, and that will generate unintended results for everybody, for the community and the department. And then they have to go back and change that policy or the training and involve more people. So it's better to get it right at the outset.
Thank you.
And so, like in some of the consent decrees I've worked on, people are involved in the proposal, the drafting, you know, like multiple red lines. There's public posting where you get written comments. That, and the people who are more involved in the drafting process from the community and the agency work on that. And then again, there's community meetings that are led by community members who will explain, let me tell you what this policy is going to be about. You know, say police dogs, like some city might have issues with officer use of canines for searches or high risk arrests, you know, where someone's in an attic in a burglary and they need a police dog to identify somebody, how to do that safely. And so they'll present what the policy is going to be. We're going to keep the dogs on leash. It's a find and bark policy rather than a find and bite policy, and explain it to them and then get that additional input. I've never seen the public input, you know, in the near final draft that didn't elicit really good ideas that everyone missed at the beginning. It's inevitable. So it can be time consuming, but it's really, really valuable. And it really does help people feel more ownership from the agency side, but also the community side in that policy. And what inevitably happens is that you have to then launch the policy and train on the policy, and then have a community commitment. You're going to come back in the next year to see what changes you need to make, because experience will generate situations where you think we didn't quite capture what we needed to do. We need to make tweaks or adjustments, and you just need to accept that. And for any good, let's say de-escalation or use of force policy and training, if you go on the web and look at the versions of the documents, you'll see it's like version 7 or version 9, because there will inevitably be situations that arise that people didn't think about and say, okay, you know, our model for handling something like a call where someone's in a position to self-harm in a residence, that it's not meeting what's actually happening in the community. And you just have to be open about that. Police leadership obviously is important, but so is community leadership. What's really vital, I just want to say this, just to get this in, because it was in the Brattleboro report. I was happy to see it. They quoted a passage from a study done by the Police Assessment Resource Center in Los Angeles, where I worked from 2002 to 2004, that emphasize the really critical need for the government, the governmental entity, to provide training support for any members of the community who are participating in the policy development or oversight. A principal concern, it's not just, it doesn't happen in policing. It happens with engineers. It happens in the airline industry. There's always a concern where professionals are subject to oversight by individuals they don't feel understand the profession. They don't understand, and this happens in medicine. It happens in law. It happens in teaching, where individuals want to make sure that those who are involved with evaluating performance or evaluating policy are themselves at least fairly well acquainted with how the occupation actually works. And a long-standing failure for a lot of civilian oversight entities is they say, okay, we're going to get 5 community members. They're going to represent these constituencies. And these individuals, it's good to get a broad selection. You have somebody who works in real estate, someone who's a basketball coach, someone who's a substance abuse counselor. And then they're kind of thrown in there, and they don't know what the rules are regarding searches after an arrest. They don't know whether an existing strip search policy meets the constitutional standard or not, or whether there are better practices out there that keep safety in mind, but also afford people more dignity. And so the Brattleboro report, I think, really zeroed in on an essential need. Whatever is the outcome here, is that there do need to be supports and resources for training opportunities so that board members are acquainted so that they can be effective. The part of the Brattleboro report found that where they've done studies of those reports that don't have the training, over time, the community oversight, so to speak, ends up agreeing with the department 90% or more of the time. Now, I can't say whether that's the right percentage, but what academic and other studies have shown is that the lack of knowledge works to the disadvantage of the community in terms of its effectiveness, but it also is an impediment to trust from law enforcement, because the rank and file may recognize that the people who are evaluating their work aren't familiar with the occupation, aren't familiar with the laws, the many regulations that apply to the profession. So it doesn't really help anyone if you don't provide those supports. And so I think looking down the road, again, we're quite a way, I think, away from offering our final views on this, but it's hard to imagine a situation where you would have an effective entity or entities of any form where they didn't have access and perhaps a mandate for training to make sure people are experienced enough so that they can become better issue spotters and better problem solvers because they're more familiar with the subject matter. On-the-job training historically has not been a very effective way of increasing the quality of community participation and oversight. So I'll stop there if there's a question about that.
Senator Rahm.
Well, actually, Julio, when you were talking, I was thinking about the year that I was arrested as a teenager by the LAPD for absolutely nothing, and it was 2003. So I wish I could say that I think the LAPD has improved, but the on-the-ground experience for Black and brown people would unfortunately tell me otherwise. And that's kind of what I wanted to ask about. It's gravely harmful for people of color to have to come out and say, this is not okay, and I am not okay, and the police are not doing their jobs properly. We just saw that in Bennington again, with a couple coming forward, having been given tickets 12 times in 20-something days, feeling like they were being run out of town by a lot of decision makers. It extracts a lot of pain and resources from people of color to have to speak up and go on the record saying that they are being harmed by the police and to file those complaints. And then nothing happens with them half the time. So I'm really like, I appreciate everything you're saying, but I'm not hearing what the Attorney General's office is doing to improve the situation. And I really want to make it specific to what are we doing, not what can we do? What would be ideal? But we are having a problem in Vermont, and we need to know what the Attorney General is doing about it.
Well, it's a great question. Under Vermont law, including Act 166, we don't have any authority over law enforcement reform other than criminal prosecution. We have representation on the Criminal Justice Council. We have one seat on that council. We don't have the ability, like the Human Rights Commission does, to do a civil investigation of racial profiling and the like. So we've been tasked in this law to get input not only from law enforcement, but from a broad range of Vermonters in different organizations to hear about what they want in terms of increased accountability mechanisms. So that's our job under 166, is to get that information and offer some recommendations or ideas to the legislature. Along the way, we certainly interact with law enforcement and members of the council to identify instances or problems that they're trying to solve. But we don't have a legal charge to do that. That's not, I mean, I can't make a police chief anywhere sit down to talk with me or answer to me or produce files for my review. We don't have that. I mean, one of the things we'll be talking about later as this project develops are models of oversight that include that kind of authority. For example, you may be aware the House passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And one provision of that law allows state attorneys general to conduct pattern and practice investigations, very much like the DOJ does for police departments, where they investigate whether an agency is, kind of chronically, systemically discriminating against the community. Vermont doesn't give us that authority. Most states do not have that authority. Congress is proposing it in a bill right now that's before the Senate.
Senator Clarkson.
Thank you. So Julio, given that you feel you need further time to make a recommendation on community engagement or community oversight model, whatever we're going to call it, I would hope it would have a more proactive name. When do you feel you have that in time for us to take action on this year or later this session, this summer? When do you think you'll actually have that work done enough to make a recommendation?
I would say my best projection is it's probably going to run into the summer. In part, and I'm very proud of this, but there's been a lot of work right now in communities in getting certain underserved communities vaccinated. And so there's been a lot of energy that's been devoted to that, which I think is terrific. But I think we still have a lot of work to do. There are lots of folks in towns we want to talk to. And that's going to be on, in smaller sessions, but also we anticipate having, a number of, I assume for most of them, there'll be Zoom-based town hall kind of meetings. And then also soliciting, written input from organizations. We're also talking, by the way, and I'm a real believer in this. If you're thinking about creating an organization that, or building up an organization that engages in oversight, go talk to the professionals who do that. So, for example, Monday, I'm talking to a lawyer who right now works for the Pennsylvania Attorney General, but she worked for years as an investigator in the Office of Police Complaints in Washington, D.C., and then the parallel office in New York City. And she's agreed, by the way, to talk to some of the Vermont cities and towns about her experience so she can tell you, what were her frustrations as an investigator under a given system. I think that's really one of the best ways to do it. So we're getting that sort of input from people who are either experts or people who work in the field.
May I just follow up?
Yep.
Which is, if you haven't done one in Windsor County or East Side, I'd love to be in. I mean, if it was appropriate, I'd love to be invited to one of those.
Oh, of course.
What?
Of course. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, but I mean, have any of the rest of my colleagues on this committee been invited to join one of those?
I don't think, the person who on this project I'm working with, Dave Scher, Assistant Attorney General David Scher, who I think you've met before on more than one occasion. Yeah, so Dave has been more the one dealing like with a lot of the scheduling. So I'm not really, familiar with like what the latest details are. But what I've been saying when I have been talking to folks is that we're going to talk to you more than once. It's not enough to meet with somebody for a half an hour or give them 5 minutes in a town hall, because what happens is we go on to the next group, we get their ideas, and then we want to go back to the first folks and say, hey, yeah, this is an issue we overlooked. What do you think about that? So it's very involved, and there'll be multiple opportunities. Any of the events that we do with communities, everybody's going to be invited from that. I mean, we're going to try to arrange speakers who are from that community, but it's going to be available to everyone. And there'll be multiple opportunities because we're never tired of hearing from people. I mean, it's really, really important. It is, there's a lot of research to be done about existing entities and that sort of stuff. And we've done a lot of that, but it's really hearing what the communities want, because they have very different views about what they want.
And
before I go to you, Senator Clarkson, I think we need to be really careful about, and this just jumped out at me when Senator Clarkson, when you said, I hope we can have a more proactive name or something like that you said. And I think that we need to acknowledge that what we have in Vermont is many, many different types of communities. So we have approximately 65 or 70 municipalities that actually have police departments. We have about 180 towns that don't have police departments. So what Dummerston does in terms of its public safety and how it's going to respond to public safety is going to be very, very different than Brattleboro. Brattleboro can have some kind of a community involvement, community oversight, whatever it is. Dummerston has nothing to oversee because they don't have a police department. They don't have, so I think we need to be very careful about thinking that whatever we come up with, some places may call it a citizen review committee. Some places may call it a public safety advisory committee. Or so I just wanted to point that out, that we need to be really careful that we're not thinking that there's going to be something here that's going to solve this. And then I think we need to also make sure that when we're having these conversations, and particularly around investigating disciplinary actions, that kind of thing, that we remember that we have a whole new criminal justice council that has a really, really active right now investigation subcommittee that is made up of mostly non-law enforcement people, some law enforcement people on there also. So we need to be really careful that we don't set up something that is going to conflict with that. They're working very hard, the community representatives on there, to make sure that they're setting up the right kind of investigative oversight of. And so I just think we need to, it's much more complicated than just having Brattleboro set up some kind of an oversight committee. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more fully. But I think it goes back 2 years to our tour of the state and to our thinking broadly about how do communities envision public safety in their communities, whether they have a police department or not. I mean, they have a vision. I bet if you ask people in Dummerston, or if you ask people in Reading or Mount Holly, places that don't have police departments, but that I bet they have if there was a group of people that came together to talk about what's your vision for your public safety? How do you envision? I mean, I think it's a bigger, I wasn't wanting to be prescriptive at all. I actually think it goes to our questions from 2 years ago, which is what's a community's vision for its own public safety?
Yeah, I agree with you. And one of the things that we are going to hear is the inventory that we've asked the planning commissions to do on how many towns actually have public safety plans and what is constituted in those plans. So we will be hearing from them about that inventory. But the whole, I think that in my mind here, the important thing is to be getting the community, and I'm talking here about the broad community with representing all aspects of its community, and the public safety people to be able to come together and talk, and there might be different things in different communities growing out of that conversation. And in some, I just think that is the most crucial thing, is to get people to sit down together and begin to form that trust so that they really can talk about what are some of the issues here and how do we approach them, and how do we and not necessarily even the community group coming up with the policy, but here's what we expect. Here's how we would like to see things happen in our community. And from that grows the policy, not the policy. Anyway, I'll be quiet now. Senator Rahm?
Well, I mean, we should probably let Julio talk a little bit more. And in some of his sort of final thoughts, I was just wondering, I imagine with most models, as you said, some towns have money for this and some don't. And we've started this conversation in this committee, regardless of the source of funding. I think the state needs to help the communities who don't have the resources have these conversations in a way that people are able to participate, which costs money. I can't imagine one of these models is free and effective at the same time.
No, they're not. And historically, that's where state government has lent its hand. Most civilian oversight entities, when you're talking about oversight of non-state law enforcement, so cities and towns, or counties, their law enforcement, the state doesn't have that much of a hand. It typically has a hand, and Vermont already has some of that. Vermont has a Human Rights Commission. Anyone who alleges a discrimination by any government agency, state or local, can go to the Human Rights Commission, which has subpoena power, has the ability to take the department or agency to court, whether that's law enforcement or any other government. We also have law enforcement certification, where officers, their quote license to practice policing is subject to revocation or suspension. In the last year, where states have taken legislative action, that's one area, which is that they've increased the role or the powers or authority of the licensing entity to investigate or take actions on officers who are engaging in actions either of excessive force or discriminatory policing, so that there's not only a consequence within the agency, whether they're disciplined or not, but their ability to practice the profession, as it were, may be an issue in critical cases as well. I think another area that you're going to see, again, I can't see the future as like what we're ultimately going to say, but it's hard for me to imagine that, and we haven't seen anybody who's spoken in opposition to it, but where the state could really benefit is to provide the kind of training support or resources for people. We have a state policing academy. We don't have any sort of entity for training or and skills building for people who are already right now engaged in law enforcement oversight. They are sort of on their own in terms of training. There are organizations like NACOL, which I've mentioned, that do provide training. I've done some of those trainings at the national conferences, but it's not really enough. It's very episodic, and it's not tailored to, the city or town or the state. So that's one area I could see where there'll be more discussions about whether the state can provide those supports, so that someone who's looking at a use of force complaint in, Northwest Vermont is applying similar skills and procedures and checklists or things like that as someone who's in, the southern part of the state, that they have a common understanding of what. One of the challenges really for these, it's kind of a details thing, but I think it's a good illustration, is that when you have an entity that might be looking at the department or someone's investigation of a critical incident, everyone can read what's in the file. But you have to have some training or experience to know what's not in the file that should be in the file. You don't know what you don't know, or you don't know what's missing unless you have exposure to that. And so, I mentioned earlier that I did this training for DOJ way back, I think it was in '99, about reviewing police shootings. We did a case study of a police or shooting investigation that a lot of the lawyers in Civil Rights Division thought was pretty good, but there were big gaps in the investigation. Things that were not in the investigation that one would expect to be in a deadly force investigation that weren't there. And many of the people in the room, because they weren't familiar with that project of reviewing a shooting case, they didn't know what was missing. So what they saw looked good, but the problems were what wasn't in the investigation, what wasn't investigated, what wasn't analyzed. And you can't really know that just by being a good reader. You have to have some experience or some training about what are the essential components of a good and fair investigation.
I think when we're talking about training here, it just dawned on me that I think we have to differentiate between what a Brattleboro or a Putney or a St. Albans oversight committee would have the ability to investigate and review, as opposed to the council, the investigate, because I'm not sure that I don't know if what we want is for the Brattleboro Advisory Committee, or whatever they end up calling themselves, to be investigating a deadly shooting. Because they haven't had the training, and I don't know that we can provide that to 250 towns, but we can provide really extensive training to the people who are on the investigation committee at the council. And it seems to me that we're talking, mostly what we seem to be focusing on is investigations of police conduct by these, we keep going back to that, to investigations. But I think that they need to be far more than that. And maybe the investigations happen elsewhere than at the community level.
It's a very good point. And I didn't mean to suggest at all that we would want to train, a couple of, select board members on how to become deadly force experts. I didn't want to suggest that at all. I was just using it as an example of even people who are well-trained and, very careful analytically. If they don't have training, they will still miss things. Part of oversight models are not just investigating. That's the most expensive model, where you build a new investigative entity. There are other ones that review completed investigations. The monitor auditor model, they're not decision makers on individual cases. What they do is they look for systemic failures. Mm-hmm. They look for, so they might say, I'm going to look at, the last 10 use of force investigations you've done to see whether you are investigating those cases fairly or not. to identify problems or suggest best practices or learn lessons. If there's an agency that's doing something really great, to share that, with other county or, neighboring towns. So that's part of the auditor model, as well. Like the commission model is one that's more involved in policy and may have some role in the say of discipline. These are all big issues, and not every community agrees about the role or the investment that they want to make. But for the ones that are going to invest in a particular type of model locally, for them to be able to go somewhere or have a resource in the state of Vermont is really, really helpful, because there are a lot of people out there who are online consultants who offer training that may not even fit Vermont's view of law enforcement. So it's very hard to zero in on quality. So, like I said, going back to what Senator Rahm said a while ago, I think that you're definitely going to see a need for supports by the states, because the localities just won't have those resources. And it also helps to have some sort of uniformity, to have people have a common basis for training and to cross-train. So I think that when you have communities where people who are participating in policing in one community know their counterparts for other communities, so that everybody knows what they're doing and they're learning from each other, because they will all encounter many of the same issues. They might be dealing with issues of race, poverty, mental illness, homelessness, as well as law enforcement's role, if any, in the schools. And so to have some common source of information, I think, is probably going to prove to be very helpful. But we don't know the details of that because we're still listening to folks. And we're happy to talk to any of you or anybody you recommend as much as possible. The emphasis here is that it's multiple conversations with a lot of people.
Right.
Any questions or comments?
No, go.
Okay.
Good luck as you continue.
Okay.
And if you do anything on this side, I'd love to be a fly on the wall.
Definitely, sure.
And Matt.
Okay. Anything else?
You're muted, Madam Chair.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to suggest that we take a 5-minute break.
Yippee.
That we come back and that we schedule Julio in maybe 2 weeks to just come back and give us an update again, and also talk about the issue of the central reporting point, and whether you've made any headway on that issue. And
Sure.
And maybe when you come in next time, we can have somebody from the council and maybe a couple people from the community members on the council to join us in the conversation.
That's a great idea. Sure.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Julio.
Thank you.
As
all.
always,
Thank you.
very
Always good to
informative.
see you.
Thank you. Thank you
Thanks.
for your time. I appreciate the attention.
Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break